Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome back to my Raid Retrospective series. While Dawn Trail's raids have been generally well received, the devs themselves have said they've been looking back on old fights, naming specific ones such as Turn 4 and the Binding Coil of Bahamut for inspiration for things they could do going forward, specifically with our most recent tier. With that in mind, we've been doing the same, looking back on old raid tiers to see what lessons they could learn, both for better and for worse. So we already covered all of A Realm Reborn, we already covered all of Heavensward, so now we are moving on to Stormblood, where we will be looking at the Omega raid, starting with Deltascape. Now this was the first tier in Stormblood, which before even actually talking about the raid tier, the unlock itself taught them a valuable lesson that they have not repeated in quite some time. You know, Stormblood's launch was historically plagued with overcrowded single-player instances, leading to the Great Cold Steel debacle, where players were hard stopped at the game's first solo instance for hours, even days, due to overcrowding. This actually continued 2 weeks later into Deltascape's release, where the unlock quest had a solo instance as well. This didn't stop players for more than an hour or two, but it led to more frustrations that were already boiling over from Cold Steel. Fortunately, that solo instance was 2 weeks separated from Savage, but we'll revisit that topic in the next video. And this tier was really important because it was a true enforcement of all the lessons they learned going into and coming out of the creator. They wanted something simpler for the start of a brand new expansion, so people still learning their skills could, appropriately adapt to this new raid scene. But they also needed it to be as approachable as the creator was without all the mechanic skipping that occurred. The result was kind of mixed. There are some amazing bosses and things that happen in Deltascape, but there's also one of the worst raid bosses we've ever had released. In fact, anyone who's been around since the beginning would probably vote one of these encounters the worst Savage fight of all time. Granted, that the reasoning for that might actually be debatable amongst players. And you know what? I guess to no one's surprise, that was the first encounter against Alt Royit. The main critique of this Savage encounter is that it's nearly identical to its normal mode, with mostly tighter timing on dodging attacks and higher damage for mispositioning. It was so easy, in fact, that it was defeated in a single pull by the World First team. The fight itself is kind of hard to really break down in any sort of meaningful way. I mean, there's slow charging fire orbs in the center edge and then spread markers on the players near explosion time. Ice on the floor that makes the player slide when they move, and they either have to slide into a stack or slide into a spread after orbs explode. And wind that push players or orbs around the room. In fact, probably the only mechanic that people may remember that was, pretty funny, especially in the Party Finder, was Clamp, an untelegraphed large frontal attack that would send any player hit flying off the side if they got hit. Plenty of poorly positioned bosses and funny Clamp memes ensued, but that's really the only thing the boss was known for. And honestly, that just came from not paying attention in the normal mode, where Clamp was already a thing. Reading the cast for wasn't as common sense back then, surprisingly. The thing is, this tech being in normal mode means, again, that the funniest thing about it technically didn't even come from Savage. So just had to read and people didn't do it. Other than that, there just isn't much to dissect. There is some merit, however. I think the goal of this fight is actually a lesson in and of itself. And that may seem strange because I'm not asking for us to get another Savage mode that is normal plus practically, which is really what this was. But there's some merit in the idea of a boss being very simple compared to the other Savages, especially early in an expansion. The reason for the balancing of this is because all the job changes going into Stormblood, plus the new directions raid tiers had taken just before 4.0. They wanted players to feel comfortable getting the hang of everything while introducing them to the more approachable difficulty. As such, a fight that doesn't change much between normal and Savage, but is still that level up, is actually a great stepping stone for players looking to get their foot in the door. Final Fantasy XIV actually really struggles with large difficulty jumps between finishing the main scenario and doing literally any endgame. So while maybe not in Savage, perhaps using Extreme or some new encounter to help bridge the gap could be a valuable thing to do for the community. Now, of course, players still have to want to learn. Players still have to want to improve. And there's definitely a motivation factor that at times doesn't matter what you do. You can't fill that void. But if you provide no opportunities to the player base, or at least not enough opportunities to the player base to make each subsequent difficulty jump, then they probably will think that it's a little too beyond them. And the goal is to get people past that discomfort zone and realizing that raiding in Final Fantasy XIV is not really all that scary of a thing. Yeah, you could screw up, you could die, and you probably will. There's a reason why people with Ultimate titles, who earn them fairly, I might add, whenever they die, they get made fun of. Ultimate, by the way, or the Legend, by the way, it's because people make mistakes. It's going to happen. And an easier fight like this may just get you past that initial trepidation. So I'm not saying they should do this. I think that it would just be memed to all hell. But the idea is not an inherently bad thing, and it does address a major concern with Final Fantasy XIV in how it teaches its players to actually play the game. Now, next is Catastrophe, which is an encounter I feel a little conflicted about, whether I like it or don't. On one hand, I think it's an incredibly creative and unique encounter. There's actually no other fight in the game that is even remotely similar to this one, and its theme is executed incredibly well. On the other hand, part of that is because of its utilization of the duty action. That was their new toy in Stormblood. They started being like, ooh, look at this extra button we can give you for every fight. And it does, this special thing that only helps with this fight. In theory, that's not a bad thing, but it was just kind of clunky and unintuitive to use, especially back then. Perhaps that could be improved and used in more modern encounters now. Big problem, of course, having yet another button to press, and one that's only fight specific, so it's not like it really ties into how you play your job, but that might just create unique experiences like the one I'm about to present you with now. So the fight's theme is gravity. Every player gets a device that lifts them off the ground, changing their properties against certain attacks. Any attacks that target the ground itself, such as an earthquake or a sinking puddle, can be avoided by floating into the air. One of Catastrophe's attacks will also knock these players back from the impact point. So if you're floated in the air and he jumps on the stack marker, he'll knock you all away, which of course plays into how the fight is actually intended to be done. The game also utilizes these two different elevations in two-tiered split damage AoEs. Basically, two players right on top of each other with two different stack markers at two different elevations with two teams of 4 on those two elevations. Functionally, it's cool, and it has actually been done very recently. Something sort of similar was done without the use of a duty action in the most recent Forked Tower raid. The very first boss has stack markers that are in the air that need to be taken by a set group of people. So the idea has finally, I think that's the first time it's ever been reutilized in a capacity, and also again without the actual use of the duty action. But foregoing, that's one instance where the elevation difference is a thing. This whole fight is built on that precedent, so I'm not going to give Forked Tower too much credit on that. And the rest of the fight outside this actually utilizes some things taken from the creator that are really well done. Like, you almost wouldn't even think about them being from the creator. One has you place these earthquake monitoring tentacles around the room, and then you use them to figure out where the safe spot to dodge is, because they basically detect if there's an earthquake under them. You have free reign of it, free control of it, and the interpretation is not exact. So while most people would do a fairly standard setup for it, it just give the player a little bit of agency on how the room is utilized and how the positioning of all these things is actually utilized. There's also dodging AoEs that only hit certain elevations, high and low, percentage-based damage from the boss, 3-part tank busters with a swap in between, which isn't much, but even those types of things are scarce nowadays. Honestly, outside of the clunkiness of the duty action, like I said, this is one I feel conflicted about because I have a great appreciation for it. I just wish they would make it less clunky and then consider going back to it. I love the idea of fights that have very unique properties that only make sense on that particular boss, or at the very least make more sense and we don't see them very often, so it's not like something that we should repeat over and over again. And trust me, we'll be getting into the idea of repeating something over and over again when it comes to the Stormblood raids. Then we come to Halicarnassus, which I would say is some people's favorite fight in all of Stormblood when it comes to the Savage encounters. Halicarnassus manages to provide a fast-paced, dynamic, traditional encounter, which is weird because traditional encounters in 14, they might target somebody different, but they're rarely actually dynamic. They're pretty scripted most of the time. Maybe there is a script for Halicarnassus and nobody ever figured it out. Hallie herself as a boss, a couple of things right off the bat. A tank buster that auto-crits, which back then meant the awareness button was an unusually powerful tank cooldown. We've moved away from critical hits in a lot of content from bosses to normalize damage, but it wouldn't be the worst thing ever to give it back to tanks in some way, or give it to a specific tank, which, talking about job identity, yeah, most bosses don't have something that auto crits, but What if you had one tank that could specialize against bosses that crit, or specialize against adds that crit, and then that tank now has a unique property that gives it some job identity? Just saying, something to consider. She also has a few basic AoEs to dodge, but she can also haste them to force a much faster reaction out of the team. Even the mechanic where she gives people spreads and stacks and then swaps their positions with each other is pretty unique and worth revisiting. However, the big thing people remember from her is the playing field. She warps the arena into several different types of arenas with different panels that the player and boss have to interact with to solve her mechanics. Whenever she uses the Queen's Waltz skill, it takes the type of floor panel that's active and does a different mechanic. As the fight progresses, she forces you through several different types of panels, initially just to teach you what Queen's Waltz will do with each of them. She also summons adds on each of them, which, you know, we've already talked about that here, and M6 in the more recent years is a popular one. And this utilizes a very frequent flow of changing adds. You don't get the same adds over and over again here. You just constantly get new ones phase to phase, and they each have their own strategy of how to actually manage them. But eventually, the playing field will have everything on it. You'll have to know where she's jumping, what that panel means, get into position relative to the panel, which means that static spots suddenly maybe aren't the best thing. You know, you don't want your melee having a static spot on the other side of the room just because it's safer, and maybe there's something that's in your way. Maybe the bosses jump to a spot where melee really don't have the opportunity to get in because the panels nearby are actually too dangerous to just stand on outright. So again, there's just a lot of factors that go into the entire thing. There's also a playing field that straight up has role-based panels, and one where you actually deliberately have to get hit by certain debuffs in order to make sure that all the panels are covered. The order of the debuffs is random every time. You need to know which one belongs to you and make sure that you actually get hit by it to solve the mechanic that comes a little bit later. But when all the floor panels are there, there's still new add types. There's still new mechanic types being introduced, and it's such a fast-paced, hectic encounter. Heck, one of the most stressful parts I remember isn't even dealing with all of that. There's a part where the boss summons adds and does like 6 AoEs in a row, and these things hit hard back then. You cannot just kind of supermit through them and, you know, just kind of laugh your way through dealing with it all. No, you really had to like move and make sure your mitigation healing was on point. It was one of the best encounters, and for some people, not even one of the best encounters in just Stormblood. For some people, it's one of their favorite encounters overall. I mean, we have fights that are kind of like this now, but it always feels like we're forced into maybe 2 or 3 possible patterns, even if we could see that more patterns are a possibility. Hallie is really just pure reactionary chaos, and we could definitely use more of that. That less scripted feel that she manages to provide. So this is actually an encounter they could learn a lot from. Will they? Tough call. It's hard to say that they would ever really go to something that feels as random and chaotic as some of these phases are, but if they're looking for another unique experience, we have not had something like Halicarnassus in a very long time. So it's definitely got my vote if they want to learn from something in particular. And finally, we come to the final boss of this tier, and one of the most important bosses in Final Fantasy XIV history. Phase 1 against Exdeath is a 4-minute-ish encounter with a tight DPS and execution check. In a way, it kind of feels like Faust from Heavensward, but as an actual encounter. The mechanics machine gun at the party, and many of them are quite demanding in a number of ways. Full HP checks coming after max HP reductions were off, tight kiting movements, and reactions to the boss Caspar, and some traditional downtime position checks. Now, Stormblood did actually do quite a bit of max HP checks, or reducing to 1 HP and then asking you to heal very quickly afterwards, and it actually wasn't super popular at the time. The main reason was because somebody missing 15 HP because either the boss high rolled their damage or the healer low rolled their heals, especially week 1, or both combined, could just mean they were punished just because numbers rolled the wrong way and you don't have an extra GCD to even get them back. Yeah, we have some tools that could make that a little bit easier now, but like, is that really fun to have to like be worried about missing 15? Like maybe if you did like a 95% ish threshold, it's probably, you know, to give people a little bit of room, it's a little more reasonable. But then you start saying, oh, but then, you know, you're giving people a 5% window and that's not engaging enough. So I mean, again, there's a lot of ways you can look at it, but I think there are ways for them to make this work, or even just to make it so a certain amount needs to be healed. You know, similar to like Dooms, like the full HP Dooms technically exist, where you need to get healed to full to get rid of a Doom, and those have been received well enough, and they're basically kind of the same thing as this, but they could also just do it in such a way where you need to be healed for a certain amount. I think there's just more ways for them to put on healing pressure, and this is the most basic way to do it. They could, but I mean, we could also have a debuff that, prevents your HP from being restored unless you receive your full HP worth of healing before doing it. There's lots of creative ways to involve healing, and this is really the most basic version of it. But Exdeath himself became what we would call a door boss, the first one ever. After defeating Exdeath, he transforms into Neo-Exdeath and saves a checkpoint until the end of the instance. In my opinion, Exdeath is the best door boss we ever had. The idea of a 4-ish minute tough encounter followed by a 10 to 12 minute boss, to me, is way better than pretty much everything that came after. A 7 to 9 minute door boss followed by a 7 to 9 minute actual boss. I don't know, I just think it feels better this way as opposed to the way that it was done for years and years. The biggest problem with door bosses and what Exdeath introduced is that, much like I said earlier, when Square has a new toy, they really like to play with it a little bit too much. So what you would do is you would run into a situation where they just use the same mechanic over and over and over. And door bosses definitely became their thing for several expansions after that. It was kind of weird whenever they decided not to do it. We were kind of glad when they stepped away from it in Shadowbringers, and then they brought it back in full force in Endwalker. So yeah, a little bit overdone, but now they seem to have a pretty good grasp on when they do it and when they don't do it. But we don't get anything like Exdeath and Neo-Exdeath anymore. We do not get 4-minute door boss into 10 to 12 minute encounter. Like, they don't do that anymore, and I would love to see that as opposed to the 7 to 9, 7 to 10 split that we have now. And Neo-Exdeath is also a really cool encounter for about 50% of it. I mean, he's got attacks that target everyone equally and then throw some extra things on the tank while they're doing the positions that everybody else is doing. Lots of different ways to solve that. Very unstrict mechanic, and it feels like a lot of the mechanics are relatively unstrict. You just have to make sure you meet conditions, but the way that we solve it doesn't necessarily have to be the same every single time. And I like when mechanics are a little open-ended like that. Neo-Exdeath definitely felt like it had some open-endedness to the mechanics, even if they still generally had to be completed in some certain way. I don't know if that actually makes sense. He'd fire lasers with shapes, and then you have to track your shape the entire fight. It's rare that we get a debuff that needs to be tracked an entire fight. And having really simple attention checks like that just kind of not be a thing anymore is a little strange. They're usually like phase to phase nowadays, but having a persistent mechanic that's kind of just are you paying attention, or were you paying attention to this particular mechanic again? I feel like that's something that we can benefit from, so there's a lesson learned from that one. And then on top of that, there's just other types of the same attack that you need to completely avoid. So you need to make sure you're paying attention to the type of laser that's coming out. Does it even apply to you? Do you even need to react to it? And if you do, what is the actual way that you need to react to it? So again, lots of different ways that it can be interpreted. But his main mechanic is Grand Cross, which has several different variants. Across the three kinds, there are spreads, there are gaze AoEs, there are stacks, there's a debuff where you must take lethal damage before it wears off, something they do use fairly frequently. That's not very new or underused in any way. Several players will also get knocked back from any damage they take, which means that if somebody screws up, they're probably killing half of the party, or if Neo-Exdeath is doing an attack that's unavoidable, you have to use him as your basis of where to get knocked back. This is actually pretty in line with current design philosophies, and there's a good reason. Debuff puzzles offer great opportunities to give a boss some uniqueness, both in the form of visuals and how the players interact with the boss. And other than Gavel from Midas and Heavensward, Stormblood really took the debuff dances and made it one of Stormblood's big things. Yeah, Gavel was really cool, but there's just a lot more stuff that's at least some derivative of that throughout the rest of the game from this point onward. That's why the Omega Protocol, the ultimate version of Omega, is really, really heavy on them as well, because they were just super relevant to this expansion's encounter design. He does also have some decent other mechanics, forcing stacks and spreads in different arena spots, dodging 3 true damage meant to kill through Resin Vuln type attacks, X avoids, and then just a handful of basic AoEs. He borrows from Midas in regards to his Enrage sequence, a gradually increasing raid wide after reducing everyone's HP. At this point, it's reducing it to 1. Like I said, that's a normal thing they're going to do in this expansion. Followed by a hard Enrage over a minute after he starts baby raging all over the arena. Now, all of that sounds really good. But Stormblood actually had a major problem with all of its final bosses. The boss usually uses a super attack, in this case Grand Cross Omega. at about 50%, and then just repeats the second half of the fight until the enrage sequence in the last like 15 to 20%-ish. That means by 50% of Neo-Exdeath, you'd actually progress through the whole fight, making the second half kind of feel lame after the really high octane first half. Now, I will say this, there are, again, some merits into doing this, especially early in an expansion or in content that's meant to introduce players to a higher difficulty. It gives them that sense of, oh, wait, like, I can do this. Like, if you get past that 50% mark as a player, if you need the mental boost of, you know, it not really being sure of yourself, getting through the 50% mark and then suddenly realizing you're basically done, I mean, it either has one of two effects, either depression, that there's nothing else for you to learn and that it's just kind of, oh, that's really all there is. Or you go, oh, wait, no, like I can clear now. Like I just need to do all this clean. And every first 50% of the boss is preparing you to successfully do the second 50% of the boss. That works better in some other fights in Stormblood than it does here. But it's, again, not a terrible philosophy to have when you're specifically aiming to get players in the door. I just don't think it really made sense for final bosses, and unfortunately, Stormblood really overdid that. We largely don't have this problem too much anymore. If a boss repeats anything nowadays, it's usually when it's really close to death and acts more of like a last nerve check in the last minute and a half to 2 minutes. And even then, there's usually something different, like a different order or attack timings being slightly different. But overall, I think we've largely learned not to repeat the last 50% of a fight just as is. It is quite weird to describe so much of this tier and make it seem like it was kind of a negative, but like I said, Stormblood's raid tiers were pretty well liked and do have a lot of uniqueness and things that we just don't see nowadays. Stormblood is also one of people's favorite times to refer back to for job identity. So even in these fights where they may have ups and downs, players were probably having, on average, more fun playing their jobs back in Stormblood, especially if they are someone who has been a little vocal about the job identity problem nowadays and has played for all of that time. So it does go to say something else. These encounters are not just reflective of Stormblood as an era in terms of encounter design. They're reflective of Stormblood in an era where job identity was a bit stronger for the individual jobs, more pros and cons to specific jobs, and they were still relatively modern, meaning that some of those individualities could pretty easily come back, and the encounter design can still gradually move forward or learn the lessons from the times that came before. And to think that you could pick this up from even just the first tier of Stormblood is saying a lot, because we do have a lot to say about the remaining two tiers and that of Sigmascape and Alpha. However, that is going to be a wrap for our first look at the Stormblood raids in my retrospective series. Be sure to like and subscribe and stay tuned. We got 2 more raids to go through with Stormblood, and then do we look back at Shadowbringers? I'll make up my mind about that at some point. I do think there are even some lessons to learn. It's really Endwalker where when we start to look back, we go, yeah, maybe don't do that much anymore. But anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see all of you in the next one. And until then, take care.